Clara Winters stood in the middle of the Detroit assembly line, holding nothing but a square of ordinary cheesecloth, while generals 3,000 miles away were losing tanks faster than they could ship them. The dust of North Africa was devouring million-dollar machines in days, and the solution she proposed was so simple that her own supervisor called it idiotic. But sometimes the answer to an impossible problem isn't found in engineering textbooks or military laboratories. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look foolish. What happened next would save thousands of lives and change the course of desert warfare forever. But first, one woman had to risk everything to prove that stupid ideas are only stupid until they work. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The fluorescent lights of the Chrysler Defense Plant hummed their steady mechanical song as Clara Winters wiped the grease from her hands onto a rag that had long ago surrendered to permanent staining. It was April 1942, and the factory floor stretched out like a steel cathedral, filled with the righteous noise of American industry transforming itself into the arsenal of democracy. She had been working double shifts for 3 months straight, ever since her husband Robert shipped out with the 1st Armored Division. The last letter she received from him had been dated 6 weeks ago, postmarked from somewhere the censors wouldn't let him name. But she knew from the newspapers that American tanks were grinding through the deserts of North Africa, facing Rommel's Afrika Korps in battles that would determine whether Hitler's war machine could seize the oil fields of the Middle East. Clara wasn't supposed to be working on tank assembly at all. Her official position was Quality Control Inspector for Electrical Systems, a job that kept her at a desk with clipboards and testing equipment, far from the heavy machinery and welding sparks that dominated the production floor. But the war had reshuffled every deck, and women were now doing jobs that had been considered impossible for them just 2 years earlier. She had a mechanical aptitude that her supervisors couldn't ignore, inherited from a father who had spent 30 years maintaining steam engines for the railroad. By the time she was 12, she could rebuild a carburetor faster than most grown men, and her understanding of how machines breathed and moved went beyond memorized procedures into something closer to instinct. The problem that would change everything started as a whisper in the cafeteria during the Woo night lunch break. Harold Simmons, a grizzled production foreman with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, sat down heavily at the table where Clara was eating a sandwich of rationed cheese and yesterday's bread. His face carried the weight of bad news, the kind that had been accumulating like layers of sediment until it threatened to crush everything beneath it. "We got another report from Tunisia," Harold said quietly, stirring his coffee without looking up. 3rd Battalion lost 18 M4 Shermans in 5 days. "Not from enemy fire, Clara, from the goddamn sand." She set down her sandwich, appetite vanishing. "The filters? The filters are clogging so fast that crews can't keep up. They're supposed to clean them every few hours, but the dust out there, it's not like anything we tested for. It's fine as talcum powder, gets into everything. Engine seizes up, and suddenly you've got a 30-ton coffin sitting in the open desert while German 88s bracket your position." Harold's hand shook slightly as he raised the coffee cup to his lips. "My nephew Billy is over there, tank driver, 20 years old." Clara had heard variations of this story before. The North African desert was proving to be an enemy as formidable as any German division. The sand wasn't the coarse beach sand that American engineers had used in their testing. It was pulverized stone, ground down by millennia of wind into particles so fine they could infiltrate gaskets, bearings, and most critically, the air filtration systems that kept tank engines from destroying themselves. An engine that ran perfectly in the proving grounds of Arizona would choke and die within days of arriving in Libya or Tunisia. The Army had tried everything their engineers could think of. They redesigned the filter housings, changed the filter media from paper to metal mesh, added pre-cleaners and cyclonic separators. Each modification helped marginally, but nothing solved the fundamental problem. Tanks needed to breathe thousands of cubic feet of air per minute to keep their engines cool and running, and that air carried with it the invisible assassin of desert warfare. The statistics were classified, but everyone in the factory had heard the rumors. For every tank destroyed by enemy action, another 2 were abandoned due to mechanical failure, and the majority of those failures traced back to dust infiltration. Clara worked her shift that night, with Harold's words echoing in her mind. She found herself watching the assembly process differently, paying attention to the air filter installation, with an intensity that made her neck ache from the sustained focus. The filters themselves were marvels of engineering, designed by brilliant men with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. They incorporated the latest materials and the most sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics. And they were failing in the field because reality didn't care about credentials or complexity. During her break at 2 in the morning, when the factory was running with a skeleton crew and the quality of light seemed to exist in a space between night and day, Clara walked over to the parts storage area where they kept the replacement components. She pulled out an air filter assembly and examined it under the harsh work lights, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, understanding the logic of its construction. The filter media was contained in a metal housing with carefully engineered tolerances. Air entered through inlet ports, passed through the filtration material, and emerged clean on the other side to feed the hungry engine. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, the dust was finding ways through, around, and past every defense the engineers had erected. She thought about her mother's kitchen, about the flour sifter that sat in the cabinet, about the layers of progressively finer mesh that separated coarse particles from fine. She thought about the way her mother would sometimes put a clean tea towel over the top of the flour bin to keep dust out during humid weather. Simple solutions from a domestic world that had nothing to do with military engineering. Yet they worked on the same principles of filtration and barrier protection. The idea came to her not as a flash of inspiration, but as a gradual recognition, like watching a photograph develop in a chemical bath. What if the problem wasn't that the filters needed to be better, but that they needed help? What if you could catch the worst of the dust before it ever reached the expensive, precisely engineered filter media, a sacrificial layer, something cheap and easy to replace? That would extend the life of the primary filter by handling the bulk of the contamination. Clara returned to her station and worked the rest of her shift in a state of distracted efficiency, her hands performing their assigned tasks, while her mind worked through the geometry of the problem. By the time dawn broke over Detroit and the shift change horn blasted its morning announcement, she had convinced herself that the idea was worth testing, even if it meant looking like a fool. She didn't go home after her shift ended. Instead, she went to the fabric store that opened at 8, the one where women lined up to buy material for curtains and clothing with their ration stamps. She purchased 2 yards of plain cheesecloth, the loose weave cotton fabric that her mother used for straining broth and wrapping cheese. The clerk looked at her with mild curiosity. This woman in factory coveralls buying domestic fabric at an hour when most people were just starting their workday. But wartime had made everyone accustomed to unusual sights. Back at the factory, Clara waited until the lunch break when the production floor cleared enough that she could work without drawing too much attention. She took one of the spare air filter assemblies from the parts inventory and carefully measured the dimensions of the filter housing. Using scissors from her toolkit, she cut the cheesecloth into appropriately sized pieces, creating layers that would fit inside the housing between the outer case and the primary filter element. The cheesecloth was cheap, porous enough not to restrict airflow significantly, but tight enough to catch larger particles. In her mind, it would act like a pre-filter, catching the worst of the dust before it could blind the more expensive primary filter. The modification took her less than 20 minutes to complete. She held up the modified filter assembly, examining it from every angle, trying to see it through the eyes of the engineers who had designed the original. To them, this would look like a joke, a crude hack that violated every principle of proper engineering. The cheesecloth was a fabric, for God's sake, something you used in kitchens, not precision machinery. It wasn't in any specification, hadn't been tested in any laboratory, had no theoretical basis in the fluid dynamics textbooks that guided proper design. But Clara trusted her instincts, the same instincts that had helped her father diagnose engine problems by sound alone. That let her feel when a machine was running right or wrong before any gauge could tell her. This would work. She knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with rational analysis and everything to do with a lifetime of understanding how things moved and flowed and failed. The challenge was convincing anyone else. She couldn't just install her modification on a production tank without authorization. That would be sabotage, grounds for immediate dismissal, and possibly criminal charges in wartime. She needed to go through proper channels, which meant presenting her idea to her supervisor, a man named Douglas Keller, who had been with Chrysler for 23 years and who regarded any suggestion from the factory floor with the kind of skepticism that bordered on hostility. She found Keller in his office, a glass-walled cubicle that overlooked the assembly line, surrounded by technical manuals and production schedules. He was eating a sandwich and reviewing a stack of requisition forms when Clara knocked on his doorframe. He looked up, saw her, and his expression settled into the particular kind of weariness that managers develop when they sense an inconvenience approaching. "Winters, you're supposed to be off shift. What do you need?" Clara stepped into the office, holding the modified filter assembly. "Mr. Keller, I've been thinking about the dust problem in North Africa. I have an idea that might help extend filter life." Keller set down his sandwich and leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "The Army has a whole division of engineers working on that problem. What makes you think you can solve something they can't?" "Maybe because I'm not trying to redesign the filter," Clara said, setting the assembly on his desk. "I'm just trying to help it last longer." She explained her concept, keeping her voice level and professional, describing how the cheesecloth layer would act as a pre-filter to catch larger particles. She talked about surface area and particle size distribution, using what technical vocabulary she could remember from the training manuals she had read. Keller listened with an expression that grew progressively more dismissive. When she finished, he picked up the modified filter and turned it over in his hands, his lips pursing in an expression that looked like he was trying not to laugh. "Cheesecloth," he said flatly. "You want to put cheesecloth in a tank filter. It's a proven filtration medium. It's been used for decades in food processing and other applications. In kitchens, Winters. In kitchens, not in military vehicles." Keller set the filter down with more force than necessary. "Do you have any idea how many regulations govern military equipment? Every component has to meet specific standards, has to be tested and certified. You can't just stuff random fabric into critical systems because you had a cute idea." Clara felt heat rising in her face, a combination of embarrassment and anger. "It's not random. I calculated the airflow characteristics. The cheesecloth won't significantly restrict air volume, but it will catch particles in the 20 to 50 micron range before they reach the primary filter. That alone could double the service interval." "That's stupid," Keller said, and the word landed like a slap. "That's not science. That's not engineering. That's a housewife's trick. We have real engineers with real degrees working on real solutions. I'm not going to waste anyone's time testing your kitchen experiment." The dismissal stung more than Clara wanted to admit, not because Keller's opinion mattered to her personally, but because she knew the institutional barriers she was facing. She was a woman in a man's world, a factory worker proposing changes to military hardware, someone without formal credentials trying to improve on the work of credentialed experts. Everything about the situation was designed to make her feel small and foolish. But she thought about Harold's nephew Billy, about Robert somewhere in the desert, about thousands of young men whose lives depended on machines that were failing them. She thought about the reports of tanks abandoned in the sand, crews forced to march back to Allied lines under the desert sun, while German forces claimed another victory. "What if I'm right?" Clara asked quietly. "What if this stupid kitchen trick could save lives?" Keller's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "Then the Army engineers will figure it out eventually through proper testing and analysis. That's how things work, Winters, through proper channels, proper procedures, not through improvisation by people who don't understand the complexity of what they're dealing with." "I understand complexity just fine," Clara said, picking up her modified filter. "I also understand that sometimes the right answer is simple." She left Keller's office knowing that the official route was closed to her. The military-industrial complex had its procedures, its hierarchies, its proper channels, and none of them included listening to factory workers with unauthorized modifications. But Clara had spent her entire life around people who solved problems with whatever tools were available, who made things work through ingenuity rather than resources. The official route might be closed, but that didn't mean all routes were closed. That evening, after trying and failing to sleep through the daylight hours, Clara sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter, not to Keller, not to anyone in the factory management, but directly to the commanding officer of the Armored Division Maintenance Battalion in North Africa. She had the address from one of Robert's letters, information that probably wasn't supposed to be shared, but which he had included anyway because military mail was censored for strategy, not for boring administrative details. She explained the problem as she understood it, described her proposed solution in clear and simple terms, and included detailed instructions for how to implement the modification in the field, using whatever fabric was available. She didn't claim to be an engineer or an expert. She presented herself as exactly what she was, a factory worker who understood machines and who thought she might have found something useful. She enclosed a photograph she had taken of the modified filter assembly, using her own camera and her own film ration. The letter was 12 pages long when she finished, written and rewritten until every word said exactly what she meant to say. She addressed it to Captain Lawrence Mitchell, Maintenance Battalion Commander, included every piece of identifying information she could find, marked it as concerning urgent equipment modification, and mailed it from the post office on her way to the night shift. The chances of it reaching anyone who cared were vanishingly small, she knew. Military mail was slow and unreliable, especially to forward combat areas. The letter might sit in a mailroom for months, might be lost entirely, might be dismissed as crank correspondence if it ever did reach its intended recipient. But it was the only chance she had, so she took it. The weeks that followed settled into a numbing routine. Clara worked her shifts, inspected electrical systems, listened to the radio reports of fighting in North Africa that never gave enough detail to know whether Robert's unit was involved. The newspapers talked about Tobruk and Gazala, about tank battles across hundreds of miles of desert, about heat and dust and desperate fighting. The maps showed arrows moving back and forth across the brown expanses of Libya and Tunisia, each arrow representing thousands of men and hundreds of machines grinding against each other in conditions that seemed designed to destroy both. She thought about her letter, about whether it had arrived, whether anyone had read it, whether she had just wasted 12 pages of paper and a stamp on a futile gesture. Keller avoided her in the factory, which was fine because she had nothing to say to him. The other workers noticed her distraction, but attributed it to normal wartime worry, the constant anxiety that every woman with a man overseas learned to carry like a stone in her chest. Then, in late June, everything changed. It started with a phone call to the factory office. A long-distance call from somewhere that the switchboard operator would only identify as military authority. The call was for Douglas Keller, and whatever was said in that conversation made him emerge from his office looking like he had been struck by lightning. He walked directly to Clara's inspection station, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Winters," he said, and his voice had lost all its previous condescension. "I need you to come with me. Now." She followed him to a conference room she had never been in before, a space usually reserved for visits from the corporate executives and military procurement officers. Inside, she found 3 men in Army uniforms, one of them wearing the oak leaves of a major, another the railroad tracks of a captain. The third man was a sergeant with a weathered face and dust still visible in the creases of his uniform. The major stood when she entered and extended his hand. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Major Donnelly from Army Ordnance. This is Captain Vincent from Procurement, and Sergeant Rourke, who just arrived from Tunisia yesterday." He gestured to chairs around the conference table. "Please sit down. We need to talk about your letter." Clara sat, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Sergeant Rourke was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and what might have been gratitude. "Your letter reached Captain Mitchell 3 weeks ago," Major Donnelly said, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "He's a practical man, thank God, and he decided to test your modification before dismissing it. They pulled a tank that was scheduled for engine overhaul, fitted your cheesecloth layer using material scavenged from the field hospital, and put it through operational testing in desert conditions." Clara waited, not daring to breathe. The modified tank ran for 48 hours of continuous operation before the primary filter needed cleaning. A standard unmodified tank in the same conditions needed filter service after 22 hours. Donnelly's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed what might have been embarrassment. Captain Mitchell then fitted the modification to every tank in his battalion and tracked the maintenance intervals over 2 weeks of operations. The results were consistent across all platforms. Your stupid kitchen trick, as I understand your supervisor called it, approximately doubles the operational time between filter services. The room was silent except for the distant noise of the factory floor. Clara felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Sergeant Rourke witnessed the field testing personally, Major Donnelly continued, nodding to the weathered sergeant. He volunteered to make the trip back to brief us in person because, in his words, this was too important to trust to written reports alone. Rourke leaned forward, his rough hands folded on the table. "Ma'am, I've been maintaining tanks for 6 years. I thought I knew every trick there was. What you figured out, sitting here in Detroit while we were getting our teeth kicked in by the desert, that's going to save a lot of lives. My crew, we were losing tanks so fast we couldn't keep up. Watching good machines die because the sand ate them, watching crews have to abandon perfectly good armor because the engine seized up. It was like bleeding out slowly. Your fix, it's not pretty and it's not fancy, but it works. That's all that matters." Major Donnelly opened another folder, this one containing what looked like technical drawings. "We've taken your basic concept and worked with our engineers to standardize it for field implementation. We're calling it the auxiliary pre-filtration layer, which sounds much more official than cheesecloth, though functionally it's exactly what you described. We're issuing immediate orders to all tank maintenance battalions in North Africa to implement this modification on all operational vehicles. We're also changing the production specifications here at the factory and at every other facility producing armor for desert operations." He slid a paper across the table to Clara. "This is an official commendation from Army Ordnance for your contribution to the war effort. There will also be a citation that goes into your permanent record with Chrysler, though I understand you've had some resistance from local management." Clara glanced at Keller, who was standing near the door, looking like he wished the floor would swallow him. She felt a moment of vindication, sharp and satisfying, but it was quickly overwhelmed by something larger and more profound. Men she would never meet, driving tanks across deserts she would never see, would have a better chance of coming home because of something she had figured out at her kitchen table. "There's one more thing," Major Donnelly said, and his voice softened slightly. "Captain Mitchell asked me to tell you that your husband's tank was one of the first to receive the modification. Robert, that's his name, isn't it? He's fine, by the way. Captain Mitchell made a point of mentioning that in his report." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes and didn't try to hide them. The major had the grace to look away while she composed herself, shuffling papers unnecessarily to give her a moment. "What happens now?" she asked when she trusted her voice. "Now, Mrs. Winters, we implement this across the entire North African theater as fast as we can manufacture and distribute the filtration material. Canvas duck cloth works even better than cheesecloth, we've discovered, and it's more readily available through military supply chains. We're also looking at applying this principle to other filtration systems, air and fuel both. Your basic insight that sometimes the best solution is to catch the problem before it reaches the complex system rather than making the complex system more complex. That's going to influence how we approach desert engineering going forward." Captain Vincent spoke for the first time, his voice crisp and administrative. "We're also making arrangements for you to tour other defense plants and brief their engineering staffs on practical problem solving from the factory floor. The military has realized, somewhat belatedly, that the people actually building this equipment often have insights that desk-bound engineers miss. Your story is going to become part of how we train our procurement and design officers." Clara looked at the 3 military men, at her supervisor standing awkwardly by the door, at the official papers spread across the conference table. 6 weeks ago, she had been told her idea was stupid, not science, not worth testing. Now the Army was implementing it across an entire theater of war and talking about restructuring how they approached equipment design. "I'm not an engineer," she said quietly. "I'm just someone who pays attention to how things work." "That's exactly the point," Major Donnelly replied. "The best solution to a problem doesn't always come from the person with the most degrees. Sometimes it comes from the person who's willing to look at things differently and who has the courage to speak up even when they know they'll be dismissed." The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details of implementation, production timelines, and bureaucratic procedures that Clara only half understood. But the essential fact was clear. Her stupid kitchen trick was being adopted by the United States Army, and somewhere in the North African desert, tanks were running longer and stronger because of it. When the military officers finally left, Keller approached her with an expression that might have been an attempt at contrition. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I should have listened." Clara looked at him. This man who had been so certain of his institutional knowledge, so confident in his hierarchical superiority. She could have said many things, could have made him feel small the way he had made her feel small. But she was tired, and vindication without grace was hollow. "Just listen better next time," she said. "When someone brings you an idea, test it before dismissing it. That's all I wanted. A chance to be wrong, but also a chance to be right." The news spread through the factory like wildfire. By the next shift, everyone knew that Clara Winters, the quality control inspector who worked double shifts and worried about her husband overseas, had figured out something that the Army's best engineers had missed. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, acquiring embellishments and dramatic details that weren't quite accurate, but which captured an essential truth. It became part of the factory's culture, a reminder that good ideas could come from anywhere if people were willing to listen. Production line workers started bringing Clara their observations and suggestions, things they had noticed but had been afraid to mention because they didn't have engineering degrees or official authority. Some of the ideas were impractical or based on misunderstandings of how systems worked, but some of them were brilliant, small improvements that collectively made the production process more efficient and the final product more reliable. A new culture began to emerge, one where paying attention and speaking up were valued regardless of your position on the organizational chart. Clara received her official commendation in a ceremony at the factory, with photographers from the Detroit newspapers and a speech by a general whose name she immediately forgot. They wanted to make her a symbol, she realized, a representation of civilian contribution to the war effort, a woman whose ingenuity had helped defeat the desert that was Germany's ally. She accepted the attention with as much grace as she could manage, understanding that the story was bigger than her, that it needed to be told because people needed to believe that individual actions mattered, that one person paying attention could change the course of events. But what mattered most to her came in a letter from Robert, dated 3 weeks after the ceremony, written in his cramped handwriting on paper that bore sand stains and the smell of distant places. He had heard about what she had done, heard about it from his commanding officer, who had heard about it from Captain Mitchell, who had heard about it directly from Major Donnelly. The letter was brief, constrained by censorship rules, and perhaps by Robert's own difficulty expressing emotion on paper, but one sentence stood out clearly. "You kept me running when I should have seized up. Everything I see and do and survive, I owe partly to you paying attention when nobody else would." Clara read that letter so many times that the paper wore thin at the folds, and she carried it with her through the rest of the war, through the days when news from the front was good and the days when it was catastrophic, through the grinding progression of months and years until finally the surrender announcements came and the world began the slow process of remembering peace. Robert came home in January 1946, thinner and older than the man who had left, carrying memories he would never fully share. He saw the commendation framed on their wall and smiled, touching it gently with fingers that still bore the calluses of a tank driver. "You saved more men than you know," he said quietly. "We used to talk about it, the crews, how some factory woman figured out what all the engineers missed. It made us feel like people back home actually understood what we needed." The years that followed saw Clara continue working, first at the factory during the post-war conversion back to civilian production, then later as a consultant for automotive companies who had finally realized that practical knowledge was as valuable as theoretical education. She never became famous outside the small circles of people who knew the details of military equipment development. Her name didn't appear in history books or textbooks. The modification she invented was eventually replaced by more sophisticated filtration systems as technology advanced and the specific conditions of North African desert warfare became historical rather than immediate. But in the maintenance battalions that had fought through the dust and heat, her name was remembered. Sergeant Rourke, who eventually became a master sergeant and then retired to run a garage in Ohio, told the story to every young mechanic he trained. Captain Mitchell, who survived the war and became a professor of military logistics, included it in his lectures as an example of how innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The tankers who had fought in the desert, who had seen their machines run longer and stronger because someone in Detroit paid attention, they remembered. In 1958, Clara was invited to speak at a reunion of the armored divisions that had fought in North Africa. She was 61 years old by then, her hair gray and her hands marked by decades of work. But when she stood before the assembled veterans and their families, She felt the same nervousness she had felt walking into Douglas Keller's office 16 years earlier. "I didn't do anything special," she told them, and meant it. "I just looked at a problem and thought about how my mother would have solved it. I trusted that simple solutions could work even when experts said they couldn't. That's not heroism, that's just paying attention." An old tanker in the front row, his face creased with years and bearing scars from battles she could only imagine, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, you're wrong. What you did was believe that your idea mattered enough to fight for it when everyone told you it was stupid. That's exactly what heroism is. It's doing the right thing even when you're scared, even when people mock you, even when every reasonable person would tell you to give up and let the experts handle it." Clara looked out at the room full of men who had faced death in the desert, who had fought against human enemies and environmental ones, who had survived when survival seemed impossible. They were applauding her. These men who had actually fought the war while she had only supported it from thousands of miles away. The applause felt both deeply undeserved and profoundly necessary, recognition not of her specifically, but of everyone who had contributed in small ways to something larger than themselves. She thought about the cheesecloth, that humble kitchen fabric that had become part of military history. She thought about how close she had come to abandoning the idea when Keller dismissed it, how easily she could have accepted his expertise and forgotten her instinct. The margin between success and failure, between action and inaction, had been so thin. It took courage to look foolish, she realized, maybe more courage than it took to look heroic. In the end, Clara Winters' contribution to the war effort couldn't be measured in numbers alone, though the statistics were impressive enough. The auxiliary pre-filtration layers she invented extended tank operational time by an average of 87% in desert conditions. It reduced mechanical failures by 43% across the North African theater. It saved an estimated 300 tanks from premature engine failure, and given that each tank carried a crew of 5 men, the lives potentially saved numbered in the hundreds or more. But the real impact was harder to quantify. It was in the confidence that crews gained knowing their machines would run when needed. It was in the cultural shift within military procurement that began to value practical field experience alongside theoretical engineering. It was in the hundreds of other factory workers who saw what Clara had done and realized that their observations and ideas mattered, that paying attention and speaking up could change outcomes even when the institutions they worked within resisted change. The stupid kitchen trick that Douglas Keller had dismissed became standard equipment in every American tank sent to desert environments for the next 12 years, until advances in filtration technology rendered the auxiliary layer obsolete. By then, Clara had retired from factory work, but she continued to consult on mechanical problems, to teach young engineers that the best solutions were often the simplest ones, that complexity for its own sake was just another form of failure. She lived to see the story of her modification become legend, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with the same essential message. That individual action matters, that stupid ideas are only stupid until they work, that the courage to look foolish is sometimes the most valuable courage of all. The war produced thousands of heroes, men and women, who sacrificed and suffered and saved the world from darkness. Clara Winters never considered herself one of them. She had just paid attention to a problem and thought about how her mother would solve it. She had trusted her instincts when experts dismissed her. She had been willing to be wrong in pursuit of being right. In the great machinery of history, with its grand battles and sweeping campaigns, it's easy to miss the small gears that make everything else turn. Clara's cheesecloth modification was one of those gears, unglamorous and easily overlooked, but essential to the functioning of the whole. Without it, tanks would have continued choking in the desert dust. Crews would have continued abandoning good machines because they couldn't breathe, and the casualty lists would have been longer. Years after the war, after Robert had passed away, and Clara herself was in her final decade, she gave an interview to a local historian documenting civilian contributions to the war effort. The historian asked her what she wanted people to remember about her story. Clara thought for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes looking at something beyond the room they sat in. "I want them to remember that they should trust themselves," she said finally. "Not blindly, not arrogantly, but trust that if they pay attention, if they think about problems honestly, they might see something others miss. The world needs experts, needs people with knowledge and training, But it also needs people who are willing to look at expert solutions and ask if maybe there's a simpler way. Progress comes from both. She paused, smiled slightly. And I want them to remember that stupid ideas aren't stupid until they're proven stupid. Sometimes you have to be willing to look like a fool to discover you're actually right. That's uncomfortable. It's frightening, but it's how things change. Not through grand gestures usually, but through small acts of courage by ordinary people who refuse to be dismissed. The cheesecloth filter modification that Clara Winters invented in 1942 was officially retired from military service in 1954, replaced by advanced cyclonic filtration systems that didn't require the auxiliary layer. But in garages and workshops across America, in the culture of people who worked with their hands and trusted their instincts, the story persisted. It became a parable about the value of practical knowledge, about the importance of listening to people regardless of their credentials, about the courage required to speak up when you know you'll be dismissed. Clara died in 1973, at the age of 76, in the same house where she had written her letter to Captain Mitchell 31 years earlier. Her obituary in the Detroit newspaper mentioned her wartime contribution in a single paragraph, a footnote to a life that had been mostly ordinary, mostly concerned with the small daily victories of work and family and persistence. But for the people who knew the full story, who understood what she had done and what it had meant, Clara Winters represented something essential about how change happens and how problems get solved. Not through institutional hierarchies alone, not through credentialed experts alone, but through the combination of knowledge and instinct, of willingness to experiment and courage to persist. Through people who pay attention to the world around them and who trust that their observations matter even when others say they don't. Through small acts of ingenuity that accumulate into large effects. Through stupid ideas that turn out to be brilliant. Through ordinary people who do extraordinary things simply because they refuse to accept that nothing can be done. The tanks that rolled through the North African desert in 1942 and beyond, breathing filtered air through layers of humble fabric, carried more than just armament and armor. They carried the accumulated wisdom of factory workers and field mechanics, of people who understood that machines were not mysterious black boxes, but comprehensible systems that could be improved by anyone willing to pay attention. They carried Clara Winters' refusal to be dismissed, her willingness to look foolish in pursuit of being useful, her trust that simple solutions could work even when complexity was demanded. In the end, that was her legacy. Not the specific modification, which became obsolete as technology advanced, but the principle behind it, that every problem has multiple solutions, that expertise should be respected but not worshipped, that paying attention matters, that individual action can ripple outward to change the course of events, that sometimes the answer to an impossible problem is hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look foolish, someone willing to trust their instincts against institutional resistance, someone who understands that the most important discoveries often come not from laboratories, but from kitchens, not from textbooks, but from experience, not from the people who are supposed to know, but from the people who actually pay attention. The cheesecloth that saved tanks in the desert was, in the end, just fabric. But what it represented, the mindset and courage that led to its use, that was something more valuable than any material innovation. It was a reminder that the world changes through small acts of observation and courage, through people who refuse to accept expert dismissal, through the accumulated weight of ordinary people doing their best to solve problems with whatever tools they have available. Clara Winters never sought recognition for what she did, never demanded that history remember her name. She had simply paid attention, trusted herself, and refused to be silent when she knew she had something valuable to contribute. In doing so, she kept tanks running and crews alive, changed how military procurement approached innovation, and left a legacy that transcended the specific technical contribution she made. The stupid kitchen trick that saved an army was never really about cheesecloth at all. It was about courage and persistence and the radical notion that good ideas can come from anywhere if we're willing to listen. That lesson, more than any technical innovation, is what Clara Winters left behind. And in a world that still struggles to value diverse perspectives and practical knowledge, it's a lesson worth remembering.